The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Texas, as Maria Elena Vasquez walked toward the general store. Her dark hair caught the light, revealing the reddish highlights that marked her mixed Apache and Mexican heritage. At 19, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the whispered comments that followed her wherever she went in the small town. "There goes that half-breed girl again," muttered Mrs. Henderson from her porch, loud enough for Maria to hear. "Don't know why her grandmother keeps her around. Nothing but trouble, that one." Maria's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Her grandmother, Esperanza, had taught her to hold her head high despite the cruelty of others. "Mija," she would say, "your blood carries the strength of warriors and the wisdom of survivors. Never let them make you ashamed of who you are." But today felt different. There was a tension in the air that made Maria's skin crawl. Groups of men stood outside the saloon, their voices carrying across the street in angry whispers. She recognized several faces from the Thompson Ranch, including the foreman, Jake Morrison, whose pale eyes had been following her with increasing boldness lately. The general store bell chimed as Maria entered, grateful for the temporary refuge. Old Mr. Patterson looked up from his ledger and gave her a kind nod. He was one of the few people in town who treated her with basic human decency. "Morning, Maria. How's your grandmother feeling today?" "Better, thank you for asking, Mr. Patterson. The medicine you ordered helped with her cough." Maria placed her small basket on the counter. "I need some flour, salt, and if you have any, some of that peppermint tea she likes." As Mr. Patterson gathered her items, the bell chimed again. Maria's heart sank as Jake Morrison and two other ranch hands entered. Their boots echoed heavily on the wooden floor, and she could smell the whiskey on them even from across the store. "Well, well," Jake drawled, his voice thick with alcohol and malice. "If it isn't the little Indian princess. Heard your grandmother's been filling your head with stories about your so-called Apache royalty." Maria kept her eyes on the counter, but her hands clenched into fists. "I'm just buying supplies, Mr. Morrison. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sweetheart, you are trouble. You and your kind don't belong here among decent Christian folk." Mr. Patterson stepped forward, his face stern. "That's enough, Morrison. This is my store, and I won't have you harassing my customers." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Your customers? This half-breed witch ain't worth the spit it would take to drown her." He turned back to Maria, who was now trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "Your grandmother's been spreading lies about her bloodline, claiming she's descended from some great Apache chief. But we all know what she really is. A fortune-teller who cons desperate folks out of their money." The accusation hit Maria like a physical blow. Her grandmother Esperanza was indeed a curandera, a traditional healer who used herbs and ancient knowledge to help people. But she had never claimed to be anything more than what she was, a woman trying to survive and keep her granddaughter safe. "My grandmother helps people," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite her fear. "She's never taken money from anyone who couldn't afford it." "Helps people?" One of Jake's companions, a thin man named Bill, spat into the brass spittoon near the door. "She fills their heads with heathen nonsense and devil worship. My wife went to her last month for her headaches, and now she's talking about spirits in the wind and other such blasphemy." Mr. Patterson moved to stand beside Maria. "I think you boys have had enough to drink for one morning. Why don't you head back to the ranch and sleep it off?" Jake's face darkened. "Don't tell us what to do, old man. We're just having a friendly conversation with the local witch's apprentice here." He took a step closer to Maria, and she could see the cruel glint in his eyes. "Tell me, girl, do you read palms like your grandmother? Can you see the future?" Despite every instinct screaming at her to remain silent, Maria found herself speaking. "I can see enough to know that hatred poisons the soul. And I can see that you're a coward who only feels strong when picking on women and old men." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's face turned red, and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. The other two men shifted nervously, suddenly aware that things had escalated beyond their comfort level. "What did you just call me, you little half-breed witch?" Before Maria could respond, the door burst open again. This time, it was Sheriff Collins, a weathered man in his 50s who had known Maria since she was a child. He took in the scene with one glance: the three drunk ranch hands, the terrified girl, and old Patterson standing protectively beside her. "Morning, gentlemen, Maria." The sheriff's voice was calm, but carried an undertone of authority. "Is there a problem here?" Jake straightened up, trying to appear more sober than he was. "No problem, Sheriff. Just making conversation with our local fortune-teller's granddaughter." Sheriff Collins looked at Maria, who was now pale but still standing straight. "Maria, everything all right?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. The sheriff studied the men for a moment longer, then stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Well then, I think it's time you boys headed back to work. I'm sure Mr. Thompson is wondering where his best hands have gotten to." Reluctantly, the three men filed toward the door, but Jake paused beside Maria one last time. "This isn't over, girl. Your grandmother's time in this town is coming to an end, and so is yours." After they left, the store felt unnaturally quiet. Mr. Patterson finished packing Maria's supplies with shaking hands, refusing her money. "Take these home to your grandmother, child, and tell her she might want to be extra careful for a while." Sheriff Collins walked her to the door. "Maria, I want you to listen to me carefully. There's been talk around town, ugly talk. Some folks are saying your grandmother's healing practices are unnatural, maybe even, well, you know what they're implying." Maria's blood ran cold. She knew exactly what he meant. In small frontier towns, accusations of witchcraft could be deadly, especially for women who didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable society. "Sheriff, my grandmother has never hurt anyone. Everything she does comes from knowledge passed down through generations. She uses herbs and prayers, nothing more." "I believe you, Maria, but belief doesn't matter when fear takes hold of people's hearts. And Jake Morrison has been stirring up that fear, claiming your grandmother cursed his cattle when they got sick last month. That's ridiculous. His cattle got sick because he lets them drink from the polluted creek near the old mine. You know that, and I know that. But scared people don't always listen to reason." The sheriff placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm going to do everything I can to keep you and your grandmother safe, but you need to be careful. Maybe consider leaving town for a while, visiting relatives somewhere else." Maria's heart sank. This was their home, the only place she had ever known. Her grandmother was too old and frail to travel far, and they had no other family. "We have nowhere else to go, Sheriff." "I was afraid you'd say that." He sighed deeply. "Just be careful, Maria. And if anything happens, anything at all, you send word to me immediately." The walk home felt longer than usual. Maria's small adobe house sat at the edge of town, surrounded by a garden where her grandmother grew the herbs she used for healing. As she approached, she could see Esperanza sitting on the front porch, her weathered hands busy with some needlework. "Mija, you look troubled. What happened in town?" Maria set down her basket and sat beside her grandmother, suddenly feeling very young and very scared. "Abuela, they're saying terrible things about us, about you." Esperanza set down her sewing and looked at her granddaughter with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of her 72 years. "Tell me everything." As Maria recounted the events at the store, she watched her grandmother's face. Esperanza showed no surprise, only a deep sadness that seemed to age her further. "I had hoped we would have more time," Esperanza said quietly. "But I have seen the signs. The wind carries whispers of change, and not all change is good." "What are we going to do, Abuela? Sheriff Collins thinks we should leave town." Esperanza was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently touching the small medicine bag she wore around her neck. It contained herbs and stones that had been blessed by her own grandmother decades ago. "We cannot run, mija. This is our home, our land. My bones will rest here, as my mother's do, and her mother's before her." She turned to face Maria fully. "But you are young. You have your whole life ahead of you. I'm not leaving you." Maria's voice was firm. "Whatever happens, we face it together." That evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Maria helped her grandmother prepare the evening meal. They ate in comfortable silence, but both women were lost in their own thoughts. The normalcy of their routine felt fragile, as if it might shatter at any moment. After dinner, Esperanza began teaching Maria things she had never shared before: family stories, healing songs, and the location of important medicines hidden throughout their property. It felt like she was passing on a lifetime of knowledge in a single evening. "There is something else you must know, mija," Esperanza said as they prepared for bed. "Your heritage is not something to be ashamed of, no matter what they say. Your great-great-grandmother was indeed the daughter of a respected Apache leader. She survived the long walk, the forced removal of our people to the reservation. She escaped and made her way here, where she met your great-great-grandfather, a Mexican vaquero who loved her despite the dangers it brought to both of them." Maria had heard pieces of this story before, but never in such detail. Their love was forbidden by both cultures, but they persevered. They raised children who were strong and proud, who learned to walk between two worlds. That strength lives in you, Maria. No matter what happens, remember that you come from survivors. That night, Maria lay awake listening to the sounds of the desert, the call of coyotes in the distance, the whisper of wind through the sagebrush, the settling of their small house. Everything felt different now, charged with an ominous energy that made sleep impossible. She thought about her grandmother's words, about the strength of her ancestors. But she also thought about Jake Morrison's threat, about the fear in Sheriff Collins' eyes, about the way people looked at her as if she were something dangerous and unnatural. Around midnight, she heard the sound of horses approaching. Her heart began to pound as she crept to the window and peered out through the curtains. In the moonlight, she could see several riders gathered at the edge of their property. They sat motionless for what felt like hours, just watching the house. Maria wanted to wake her grandmother, but Esperanza needed her rest. Instead, she kept vigil by the window until the riders finally departed just before dawn. The next morning brought no relief. Word had spread through town about some new accusation against her grandmother. According to the rumors, Mrs. Peterson's baby had taken ill after Esperanza had blessed the child during a chance encounter at the market. By afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside their house. Maria recognized several faces from church, people who had once smiled and nodded politely when they passed on the street. Now they stood with hard eyes and worried expressions, murmuring among themselves. Sheriff Collins arrived as the crowd was growing larger. He approached the porch where Maria stood protectively in front of her grandmother. "Ladies, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said quietly. "It's for your own protection. The mood in town is getting ugly, and I can't guarantee your safety if you stay here." "What are the charges, Sheriff?" Esperanza asked, her voice steady despite the fear Maria could see in her eyes. "There are no formal charges yet, but there are allegations. Mrs. Peterson swears you put a hex on her baby. The child developed a fever the night after you touched him." "I blessed that child," Esperanza said firmly. I wished him health and happiness, nothing more. If he is ill, perhaps Mrs. I. Peterson should look to the milk from her cow, which I noticed has been acting strangely." The crowd stirred restlessly at her words, and Maria heard someone shout, "She admits it! She put a curse on the Peterson cow, too!" Sheriff Collins held up his hands for quiet. "Now hold on, everyone. Let's not jump to conclusions." But Maria could see that it was too late for reason. Fear had taken hold, and fear was a wildfire that consumed everything in its path. She looked at the faces in the crowd, people she had known all her life, people her grandmother had helped through illness and loss, and saw only suspicion and hatred. "Sheriff," Maria said quietly, "if we come with you, will you guarantee our safety?" Before he could answer, someone from the back of the crowd shouted, "Don't let them escape! They'll just curse us all before they go!" The crowd pressed closer, and Maria felt her grandmother's hand squeeze hers. In that moment, she understood that their quiet life was over, regardless of what happened next. The damage had been done, the accusations made. Even if they proved their innocence, they would never again be able to live peacefully in Cedar Ridge. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard where they had once felt safe, Maria realized that her grandmother had been right about seeing signs in the wind. Change was coming, and it would test every ounce of the strength their ancestors had passed down to them. Sheriff Collins helped Maria and her grandmother into his wagon as the crowd grew more restless. The jail wasn't much, just 2 small cells in the back of his office, but it was the safest place he could think of until things calmed down. As they rode through town, Maria noticed how people stopped their conversations to stare, how children were quickly pulled inside houses, how curtains twitched in windows. "I'm sorry about this," the sheriff said over his shoulder. "I'll try to get this sorted out as quickly as possible." But even as he spoke, Maria could see doubt in his eyes. The Peterson baby had taken a turn for the worse during the day, and more people were coming forward with stories of strange coincidences after encounters with Esperanza. A horse had gone lame, milk had soured unusually fast, and old Mr. Garcia claimed his arthritis had flared up something fierce after asking Esperanza about herbal remedies. The jail office was cramped and stuffy. Sheriff Collins made them as comfortable as he could, bringing blankets and promising to fetch their evening meal from the boarding house. But as night fell, the sound of voices outside grew louder and more agitated. Through the small barred window, Maria could see torches being lit in the street. The crowd that had started with a dozen worried neighbors had swollen to include ranch hands from several properties, men from the saloon, and even some of the supposedly respectable town council members. "Sheriff," Jake Morrison's voice carried clearly through the walls, "we demand you release that witch to face proper justice." "There will be no lynch mob in my town," Collins shouted back from the doorway. "Anyone who tries to break the law will answer to me." But Maria could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He was one man against dozens, and the crowd was growing bolder with each passing hour. Esperanza sat quietly on the narrow cot, her hands folded in her lap. Despite the fear that must have been coursing through her, she appeared calm, almost serene. "Abuela," Maria whispered, "what are we going to do?" "We wait, mija. Sometimes that is all we can do." Esperanza's voice was soft but steady. "Your ancestors knew this kind of fear. They survived by being patient, by being strong, and by remembering that storms always pass, even when they seem endless." Outside, someone was making a speech about the dangers of allowing devil worship in a God-fearing community. The voice belonged to Reverend Hayes, the Methodist preacher who had arrived in Cedar Ridge just 6 months earlier. His sermons had grown increasingly focused on the supposed evils lurking in their midst, and Maria realized now that those sermons had been preparing the ground for this moment. "The Lord tells us to suffer not a witch to live," Reverend Hayes declared, his voice rising with religious fervor. How long will we allow this corruption to poison our children, our livestock, our very souls? The crowd roared its approval, and Maria felt her grandmother's hand find hers in the darkness. Around midnight, the voices outside began to change. Instead of angry shouting, there were whispered conversations, the sound of boots moving stealthily across the wooden sidewalks, the creak of wagon wheels. Maria pressed her face to the window but could see little in the dim light from the torches. "They're planning something," she whispered to her grandmother. Before Esperanza could respond, there was a tremendous crash as the front door of the sheriff's office burst open. Sheriff Collins shouted in alarm, and then there was the sound of a struggle, followed by an ominous silence. Footsteps approached the cell area, and Jake Morrison appeared with a torch in one hand and the sheriff's keys in the other. Behind him came 6 other men, their faces hidden in the shadows but their intentions clear. "Time to go, ladies," Jake said with a cruel smile. "The good people of Cedar Ridge have decided you need to face a higher court than Sheriff Collins can provide." "Where's the sheriff?" Maria demanded, though she was terrified of the answer. "Don't worry about him. He's just taking a little nap. Might have a headache when he wakes up, but he'll live. Can't say the same for you and your grandmother, though." The men surrounded them as they were forced from the cell. Maria tried to stay close to Esperanza, but the old woman's legs were unsteady after hours of sitting on the hard cot. As they stepped outside, Maria gasped at the size of the crowd that had gathered. It seemed like half the town was there, faces lit by torch flames, eyes bright with the terrible excitement of mob justice. A wagon waited in the street, its bed lined with rough wooden planks. Jake Morrison grabbed Maria's arm and roughly pushed her toward it. "Wait," said Reverend Hayes, stepping forward with his Bible clutched in his hands. "Perhaps the girl can be saved. She's young, misguided by her grandmother's evil influence. If she renounces the devil's work and accepts proper Christian guidance." For a moment, Maria felt a flicker of hope. But then she looked at her grandmother's proud, dignified face and knew she could never betray the woman who had raised her, who had given her everything. "My grandmother is no witch," Maria said clearly, her voice carrying across the crowd. "She's a healer who has helped more people in this town than anyone else. If you hurt her, you're committing murder, not justice." The Reverend's face hardened. "Then you choose to follow her path into damnation. So be it." They were loaded into the wagon like cargo. Maria tried to shield her grandmother from the roughest handling, but there was little she could do. As the wagon lurched into motion, she could see they were heading out of town, toward the old oak grove where community gatherings were sometimes held. The ride seemed to last forever, but Maria knew it was only a few miles. When they finally stopped, torches were planted in a circle around 2 massive oak trees whose branches intertwined overhead. Someone had already been busy preparing for their arrival. Ropes hung from the largest branch, and at the base of each tree, bundles of kindling had been stacked. Maria's blood turned to ice as she understood what they intended. This wasn't going to be a quick hanging. They meant to burn them alive. "Please," she said, as rough hands pulled her from the wagon. "Please, my grandmother is an old woman. Whatever you think she's done, she doesn't deserve this." "Evil doesn't deserve mercy," Jake Morrison replied, "and neither do those who serve it." They tied Esperanza to one tree and Maria to the other, using thick ropes that bit into their wrists and ankles. The kindling was arranged carefully around each tree, and Maria could smell the coal oil that had been poured over the dry wood. As the preparations were completed, the crowd grew quieter. Some of the earlier enthusiasm seemed to be wearing off as the reality of what they were about to do sank in. A few people had already slipped away into the darkness, unwilling to witness what came next. "Any last words?" Reverend Hayes asked, his voice now uncertain despite his earlier fervor. Esperanza lifted her head, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the night air. I forgive you, she said simply. All of you. You act from fear, and fear makes people do terrible things. But I forgive you, and I pray that someday you will forgive yourselves. Her words seemed to hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several people shifted uncomfortably, and Maria heard someone in the back say, "Maybe we should just run them out of town instead." But Jake Morrison was already reaching for a torch. "Enough talk. Let's finish this." "Wait!" The voice came from beyond the circle of torchlight, sharp with authority. "Put down that torch and step away from those women." Everyone turned toward the sound. A lone rider sat on horseback just outside the grove, barely visible in the shadows. In the flickering light, Maria could make out a tall figure in work clothes, with a rifle held casually but ready across his saddle. "This is none of your business, stranger," Jake called out. "These women are witches, and they're getting what they deserve." "My name is Thomas Hartley," the rider said, his voice calm but carrying a note of steel. "I own the Double H Ranch 15 miles south of here, and I'm making this my business." Maria had heard of the Double H. It was a large spread run by a single man who kept mostly to himself. Neighbors said he was a war veteran who preferred the company of cattle to people, but he had a reputation for fairness and honesty. "You got no authority here, Hartley," Jake sneered. "This is Cedar Ridge business. Murder is everyone's business." Hartley rode closer, and in the torchlight, Maria could see he was younger than she had expected, maybe 30 years old with dark hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. And that's what this is. Murder. "You want to burn 2 women alive because you're scared of things you don't understand." "They're witches!" someone from the crowd shouted. "They cursed our children and livestock." "Did they now?" Hartley's voice carried a note of skeptical amusement. "And I suppose you have proof of this witchcraft? Did you see them flying around on broomsticks, dancing naked under the full moon? Or are you just afraid of an old woman who knows more about healing herbs than your doctor?" His words seemed to deflate some of the crowd's righteous anger. When put like that, their accusations sounded foolish and superstitious. Jake Morrison wasn't backing down. "We don't need proof beyond what we've seen. Strange things happen wherever these two go. That's evidence enough." "Strange things happen everywhere," Hartley replied. "Babies get sick. Animals die. Crops fail. That's life on the frontier, Morrison. It doesn't mean someone put a curse on you." "You calling us liars?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maria could see the tension in Hartley's shoulders, the way his hand rested near his rifle. He was one man against dozens, but he showed no sign of backing down. "I'm calling you frightened," Hartley said finally. "Frightened people do stupid things, but you don't have to do this thing. You can still walk away." "We've come too far to turn back now," Reverend Hayes declared. "The Lord's work must be done." Hartley's laugh was harsh. "The Lord's work? You think God wants you to burn an old woman and a girl alive? What kind of God do you worship, preacher?" Before the Reverend could answer, Jake Morrison made his move. He lunged for the nearest torch, clearly intending to light the kindling before anyone could stop him. But Hartley was faster. His rifle cracked once, and the torch spun from Jake's hand to land harmlessly in the dirt several feet away. "The next shot won't be a warning," Hartley said quietly. The crowd stirred uneasily. A few men began to back away, suddenly realizing they might be in over their heads. But Jake Morrison was beyond reason now, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You want to die protecting witches? Fine by me." He drew his pistol, but before he could bring it to bear, Hartley's rifle spoke again. Jake's gun went flying, and he fell backward with a cry of pain, clutching his wrist. "Anyone else want to test me?" Hartley asked, working the bolt of his rifle with practiced ease. The crowd was beginning to fragment. What had seemed like righteous community action now looked more like a lynch mob that had been caught in the act. People began to drift away into the darkness, unwilling to face an armed man who clearly knew how to use his weapon. "This isn't over, Hartley," Jake gasped, still holding his injured wrist. "They're witches, and everyone knows it. You can't protect them forever." "Maybe not," Hartley agreed. "But I can protect them tonight, and tonight is all that matters right now." Within minutes, the grove had nearly emptied. Only a handful of the most determined remained, including Reverend Hayes, who seemed torn between his conviction and his desire to avoid bloodshed. "You're making a mistake," the preacher said as Hartley dismounted and began cutting the ropes that bound Maria and her grandmother. "These women are dangerous. They practice the devil's arts." "The only dangerous thing I see here tonight is fear and ignorance," Hartley replied without looking up from his work. "And men who use God's name to justify cruelty." As the ropes fell away, Maria's legs nearly gave out. She had been tied so tightly that her circulation was nearly cut off. Hartley caught her arm, steadying her with gentle but strong hands. "Are you all right, miss?" Maria nodded, unable to trust her voice. She turned to help her grandmother, who was swaying on her feet but still maintaining her dignity despite everything they had endured. "Thank you," Esperanza said to Hartley, her voice barely above a whisper. "You risked your life for strangers." "Yes, ma'am. Couldn't do otherwise and still call myself a man." He helped them both to his horse, a sturdy mare that stood patient and calm despite the chaos that had just unfolded. Behind them, the remaining townspeople were gathering up their torches and ropes, their earlier enthusiasm completely deflated. "Where will you take us?" Maria asked, as Hartley checked his rifle and prepared to mount. "My ranch, for tonight at least. You'll be safe there while we figure out what comes next." As they rode away from the grove, Maria looked back once at the scattered remains of what had nearly been their execution. The oak trees stood silhouetted against the starry sky, their branches reaching toward heaven like arms raised in prayer or supplication. She thought about what might have happened if Thomas Hartley hadn't appeared when he did. The image of those flames, the smell of coal oil, the weight of the ropes. It would haunt her dreams for years to come. But they were alive, and for now, that was enough. The ride to the Double H Ranch took the rest of the night. Hartley set an easy pace, mindful of Esperanza's age and the trauma they had both endured. They spoke little during the journey, but Maria found herself studying their rescuer in the moonlight. He was not what she had expected from the stories she had heard about the reclusive rancher. His face was weathered but kind, and there was a gentleness in the way he handled his horse and helped her grandmother that spoke of a man accustomed to caring for others, despite his reputation for solitude. As the sun began to rise over the distant mountains, Maria caught her first glimpse of the Double H Ranch. It was larger than she had imagined, with a sturdy two-story house surrounded by well-maintained corrals and outbuildings. Cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures, and everything spoke of careful attention and hard work. "Welcome to your new home, at least temporarily," Hartley said, as he helped them down from the horse. "I know it's not much, but you'll be safe here." Maria looked at the simple ranch house with its welcoming front porch and felt something she hadn't experienced in days, a sense of hope. They had survived the night, and perhaps, just perhaps, they might survive whatever came next. The morning sun streaming through unfamiliar curtains woke Maria from the first peaceful sleep she had enjoyed in days. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, and then the events of the previous night came flooding back. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, until she heard voices from downstairs, her grandmother's gentle tones mixing with a deeper male voice she now recognized as Thomas Hartley's. Maria dressed quickly and made her way down the wooden staircase. The main room of the ranch house was larger than their entire home had been, with comfortable furniture arranged around a massive stone fireplace. Through the windows, she could see rolling pastures dotted with cattle and horses. "Good morning, mija," Esperanza called from the kitchen. "Mr. Hartley has been very kind to us." Maria found them sitting at a large wooden table, sharing coffee and what appeared to be a substantial breakfast. Thomas stood when she entered, a gesture of courtesy that surprised her. Few men in Cedar Ridge had ever shown her such respect. "I hope you slept well, Miss Vasquez. I know the bed isn't much, but it's clean, and the room is quiet." "It was perfect, thank you. Better than we've had in a long time." Maria accepted the cup of coffee he poured for her, noticing how his hands, though calloused from ranch work, were gentle and careful. "Mr. Hartley, I don't know how we can ever repay you for what you did." "No repayment necessary. Any decent person would have done the same." But even as he said it, Maria knew it wasn't true. There had been plenty of decent people in that crowd last night, people who had chosen fear over courage when it mattered most. Thomas had already been up for hours, she learned, checking on his cattle and horses, making sure the ranch operations continued smoothly despite the unexpected guests. He had also sent one of his hired hands to town to gather information about what was happening in Cedar Ridge. "The word is that Sheriff Collins is back on his feet," Thomas reported as they ate. "Seems he's asking some hard questions about what happened last night. Several people are claiming they were never there at all, and those who admit to being present are saying they were just trying to keep things peaceful." "Cowards," Maria said bitterly. "They're all cowards." "Fear makes cowards of good people sometimes," Esperanza said gently, "but it also reveals true character in others." She looked meaningfully at Thomas, who shifted uncomfortably under her knowing gaze. Over the next few days, a routine developed at the Double H Ranch. Thomas was up before dawn every morning, checking on the animals and organizing the work for his small crew of hired hands. Maria found herself helping with the cooking and cleaning, grateful to have something useful to do. Esperanza, despite her age and the trauma they had endured, proved remarkably resilient. She spent her days exploring the medicinal plants that grew wild around the ranch, with Thomas's permission. "I never realized how much knowledge she carries," Thomas admitted to Maria as they watched Esperanza carefully harvesting herbs near the creek. "She's been explaining the properties of plants I've walked past 1,000 times without really seeing them." Maria smiled. "Abuela has been teaching me since I was small, but even I don't know half of what she knows. Her grandmother taught her, and her grandmother before that. It's knowledge that goes back generations. The townspeople called it witchcraft. People fear what they don't understand. Healing herbs and traditional knowledge become witchcraft when you're looking for someone to blame for life's hardships." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching as Esperanza carefully wrapped her gathered herbs in cloth bundles. "My mother died when I was 12, he said suddenly. "Fever took her, and the doctor said there was nothing to be done. But there was an old Mexican woman who worked on our ranch, and she tried to help with her remedies. My father wouldn't hear of it, said it was superstition and nonsense. I always wondered—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Maria understood. She had seen this before. People who wondered if traditional healing might have helped where modern medicine failed, but who were too afraid or proud to try. "Would you like Abuela to teach you about the herbs that grow here?" Maria asked. "She loves sharing her knowledge with people who are genuinely interested." Thomas nodded, and Maria could see something like hunger in his eyes. The hunger of a man who had lived alone for too long, who had forgotten what it was like to learn from others, to be part of a family. That evening, as they sat around the fireplace after dinner, Esperanza began teaching Thomas about the plants they had gathered. She showed him how to identify different species, how to prepare simple remedies, and how to store herbs properly so they would retain their healing properties. "This one," she said, holding up a bundle of dried leaves, "is excellent for headaches and muscle pain. You make a tea with just a pinch. Steep it for exactly 5 minutes. No more, no less." Thomas listened with the focused attention of a good student, asking thoughtful questions and taking careful mental notes. Maria watched the interaction with growing warmth. It had been so long since she had seen her grandmother sharing her knowledge with someone who genuinely appreciated it. A week passed peacefully, and Maria began to hope that perhaps they could stay at the ranch indefinitely. Thomas never spoke of their departure, and his hired hands, while initially curious about the two women, had quickly accepted their presence. Carlos, the elderly Mexican man who helped with the horses, had even taken to seeking Esperanza's advice about his arthritis. But the peace couldn't last forever. One afternoon, as Maria was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, she saw a dust cloud approaching from the direction of Cedar Ridge. Her heart began to pound as she recognized the riders. Sheriff Collins, accompanied by two men she didn't recognize. Thomas met them in the yard, his stance casual but alert. Maria moved closer so she could hear their conversation. "Afternoon, Tom," Sheriff Collins said, removing his hat. "I hate to bother you, but I need to speak with the two women you've got staying here." "They're under my protection, Sheriff." "Has something happened?" "Well, that's just it. Seems there have been some new developments in town. The Peterson baby made a full recovery yesterday, and Doc Miller says it was just a normal childhood fever after all. And old Mrs. Henderson finally admitted that her milk cow was getting into some loco weed, which explains why the milk was going bad." One of the strangers, a well-dressed man with a badge pinned to his vest, stepped forward. "I'm Deputy Marshal Williams from the Territorial Capital. I've been investigating reports of vigilante activity in Cedar Ridge. Sheriff Collins here tells me there was nearly a lynching a week ago." Thomas's expression didn't change, but Maria could see the tension in his shoulders. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir. And I'm told you intervened to prevent it." "That took considerable courage, Mr. Hartley." "Just did what any decent person would do." The deputy marshal nodded approvingly. "Well, sir, I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen again. I've already had words with some of the ringleaders in town, made it clear that vigilante justice won't be tolerated in this territory." Sheriff Collins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Tom, I want you to know that I never supported what happened that night. When they knocked me out and took those women from my jail," he paused, his face reddening with shame, "I failed in my duty to protect them." "You're one man, Sheriff," Thomas said quietly. "Can't fight a whole mob by yourself." "Maybe not, but I should have tried harder." Collins looked toward the house, where Maria could see her grandmother watching from the window. "I'd like to apologize to them, if you don't mind." Thomas called Maria over, and she approached warily, still not entirely trusting the sheriff who had failed to protect them when they needed him most. "Miss Vasquez," Sheriff Collins said, his hat in his hands, "I want to apologize to you and your grandmother for what happened in my town. I should have done more to protect you. I should have stood up to that mob." Maria studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Thank you for saying so, Sheriff. But what happens now? Are we safe to return to town?" It was Deputy Marshal Williams who answered. "Ma'am, you have every right to return to your home. Anyone who threatens you will answer to territorial law. I've made that very clear to everyone in Cedar Ridge." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Maria felt no desire to return to the place that had nearly seen her burned alive. The house she had grown up in would always carry the memory of that terrifying night. "Thank you," she said politely. "We'll consider our options." After the officials left, Maria and Thomas stood together in the yard, watching their dust cloud disappear in the distance. "You don't want to go back," Thomas observed. It wasn't a question. "No, I don't. And I don't think Abuela does either. Too many bad memories there." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were afraid of presuming too much. "You're both welcome to stay here as long as you like. The ranch is big enough and—" He trailed off, and Maria looked at him curiously. "And what?" "And I've gotten used to having you both here. The house feels more like a home with people in it." His face reddened slightly as he said it, and Maria felt her heart skip a beat. Over the next few weeks, she began to see Thomas differently. He was still the quiet, solitary man who had rescued them from the mob, but she also saw his kindness, his intelligence, and the loneliness that he tried to hide behind his self-sufficient facade. She noticed how he always made sure Esperanza had a comfortable chair by the fire in the evenings. She saw how he listened patiently to her grandmother's stories about the old days, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest in the history and traditions that most people dismissed as primitive superstition. And she saw how he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. One evening, as autumn was beginning to turn the leaves gold and red, Maria found herself walking with Thomas along the creek that ran through his property. They had fallen into the habit of these evening walks, ostensibly to check on the cattle, but really just to enjoy each other's company. "Maria," Thomas said suddenly, stopping beside a large boulder where they often paused to rest. "I need to ask you something." She turned to face him, noting the serious expression on his face. "What is it?" "That night when I found you and your grandmother tied to those trees, I keep thinking about how close it came. How easily I might have been too late." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I can't bear the thought of you being in danger like that again." "I'm safe here with you," Maria said softly. "Yes, you are. But what I'm trying to say is, I'd like you to stay safe here permanently, if you'll have me." He took a deep breath. "I'm asking you to marry me, Maria." The proposal hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. Maria felt her heart racing as she looked into his earnest brown eyes. "Thomas, she began, then stopped. "You need to understand something about me, about my heritage. The people in town weren't entirely wrong about who I am. I am part Apache, and I am proud of that heritage. I won't hide it or pretend to be something I'm not." "I wouldn't want you to," Thomas said quietly. "Your heritage is part of what makes you who you are. It's part of what I've come to love about you." The word love sent warmth spreading through Maria's chest. "And my grandmother? I can't abandon her." "I wouldn't expect you to. This is her home now, too, for as long as she wants it to be." Maria looked back toward the ranch house, where she could see Esperanza sitting on the front porch, her knitting in her lap and a peaceful expression on her weathered face. The old woman had found more contentment in these past weeks than she had known in years. "Yes," Maria said suddenly, surprising herself with the decisiveness of her answer. "Yes. I'll marry you, Thomas Hartley." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He took her hands in his, and she marveled at how right it felt, how safe and cherished she felt in his presence. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling minister who was known for his tolerance and open-mindedness. The only witnesses were Esperanza, Thomas's hired hands, and Sheriff Collins, who had made the journey from Cedar Ridge with a wedding gift, a beautiful set of china that had belonged to his late wife. "I wanted to make amends," he explained when Maria thanked him, "for failing you when you needed protection most." The wedding reception was held on the front porch of the ranch house, with Carlos playing guitar and Esperanza sharing stories of Apache wedding traditions. As the sun set over the pastures, Maria felt a deep sense of peace settling over her like a warm blanket. Later, as she and Thomas stood together watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fear, the hatred, the near-death experience that had seemed like the end of everything she held dear. All of it had led to this new beginning. "Do you ever regret leaving Cedar Ridge?" Thomas asked, his arm around her shoulders. Maria considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I regret the way it happened, the fear and hatred that drove us away. but I don't regret the leaving itself. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you really need. And what's that? Home, she said simply. Not a place, but people who accept you for exactly who you are. As if summoned by her words, Esperanza appeared in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Time for this old woman to go to bed," she announced. "But first—" She approached Maria and Thomas, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "I want you both to know that tonight I am the happiest grandmother in all of Texas. Mija, your ancestors would be proud to see you now, strong, loved, and free to be exactly who you were born to be." She kissed Maria's forehead, then surprised Thomas by kissing his cheek as well. "Welcome to the family, mijo. Take good care of our girl." "I will," Thomas promised solemnly. "With my life." As Esperanza disappeared into the house, Maria leaned closer to her new husband, breathing in the familiar scents of leather and horses and the soap he used. Tomorrow there would be work to do, cattle to tend, and the everyday challenges of building a life together. But tonight, under the vast, star-filled sky, she felt nothing but gratitude for the courage of one quiet rancher who had chosen to stand against hatred and fear. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound no longer seemed lonely to Maria. It sounded like a song of belonging, a voice calling others home across the endless desert night. And she was home, at last, in the strong arms of the man who had saved not just her life, but her faith in the possibility of love conquering fear. The ranch would prosper under their joint care. Esperanza would live for many more years, teaching Thomas the old ways while learning new things from him in return, and Maria would raise children who would know both their Apache heritage and their place in this new world they were creating together. But that night, as she fell asleep in her new home beside the man who had risked everything to save her, Maria simply felt grateful for the long, winding road that had brought her to exactly where she belonged.